let me start it by providing just a short little background on why the Office of Naval Intelligence was so involved in China. You know, it's like Office of Naval Intelligence, you know, what were they doing? Would you even look at their records if you were writing the history of China? Nah, you'll probably go to State Department records, Foreign Relations of America, you know, the Department of Treasury, Morgenthau, you know, all the traditional stuff, missionary, Peter Parker, you know. You might even go to Navy Department records, Chief of Naval Operations, but, you know, would you go to the Office of Naval Intelligence? No. But that's how this topic started, because my first emphasis was on Japanese espionage activities in pre-World War California. Everybody said, wow, Japanese never spied, Japanese Americans, you know. But I had a mentor who told me and go out there, you go and find evidence that they spied. That was Professor Cooks. And I said, okay, and I did. I dug up records, FBI records, naval intelligence records. I interviewed people, came up, conclusion, there was no espionage amongst Japanese Americans. He didn't like it, but that's how I started. That's how I started the project. And I said, well, it makes sense for me to follow through World War II and all that. And I kept going back to these China records. Oh, no, you have to look at these Navy files dealing with China. And I said, wow, and I started reading. These naval intelligence files on China contained a wealth of information on Japan. Japanese spy activities, Japanese economic conditions, these were all in the China files. And that's what I decided, okay, because I wanted to do Japanese language and Japanese interpreters during World War II, but I was told Roger Pinot, old-timer retired guy, that was his topic. Don't even think about touching it. He will not share his sources and he will just slam you. So I said, okay. So I stayed away from that topic. I said, well, why don't I do it on the Navy's Chinese language officer program then? You know, I've never heard of it. I only knew a little bit about it, and that was nobody else's research area. Academia is like that. That's why they don't even share sources, you know. They sit there, okay, somebody's going to steal my topic, somebody's going to use my. But I said, I don't care. I said, we read the same document, you guys interpret it, 10 different interpretations. And even right now, when I give USC this collection, whoever cites me, you got to put my name on it. You know? It's a lot easier than the traditional academic push to do that book. You know, I think that's kind of changing now. You know, based upon sources like that, you know, rich collections of material. And those China files got me going. And then what I found out was the Navy never got over the Boxer Rebellion paradigm. Because of the Boxer, it's not a rebellion, actually Boxer uprising and throw out the foreigners, you know. There's a book about it, but that always obsessed the American Navy, you know, which was in China at the turn of the century, and that's why they needed information, because their mission was to protect American business interests and rights and all their properties based in China, and the Navy was the force to do that. That's why they had a strong presence, and the duty of naval intelligence was to determine these threats. And the presence in China was huge, you know, because of the great market there. In order to spread American products, it's still the same idea, how are we going to sell all these products to China when China is selling their stuff to us today, but, you know, that's a different story. 100 million Chinese, you know, how to convert them to Christianity and how to bring them democracy. We had this great image about what we're going to do to China. And, you know, we also wanted to make sure that the other countries like Japan, like Great Britain, you know, France didn't compete with us. And if they did, that they would not push us out. So you can see from these reports that I have that throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, naval intelligence really closely followed all the political, economic, and military developments in China. And actually, we were so paranoid, you know, we included China in our war plans. Some of you may have heard that our contingency war plan against Japan was called War Plan Orange. You know, If you're a military historian, you'll know War Plan Orange, but we also had one for China, War Plan Yellow. See, I have it in my notes in some of the documents, but I've never had time to really do a full research study on American War Plan Yellow, which was targeting Japan. Let me talk a little bit about the diplomatic influence of the U.S. Navy. That's another reason why we should look at those naval records, because the U.S. Navy was scarcely less influential than the State Department. Actually, I would argue in the 20s and the 30s, the Navy was more influential than the State Department. And we can see examples of that, you know, the Navy's direct diplomacy, such as Commodore Perry's opening of Japan, or Commodore Schufeld's opening of Korea. You know, it was Navy commanders, Navy admirals who wielded the clout. And even for the Marines, U.S. Marines that the U.S. Navy used, you hear their song from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So we were in Tripoli fighting the Barbary pirates at the turn of the century, you know, for a long time, but yet it was the Navy. That's why and then Walter Heinrichs, a great historian, and he talks about this, the influence of naval policy. He said, in the national policy deliberations and decisions in which the U.S. Navy played a part, it had a firming influence on the underside of American policy, making traditional Far Eastern policy somewhat more dogmatic and absolute. It influenced not so much the course of policy as the range of choice. So we see this happening in China, but yet most of the studies that you read don't utilize these naval intelligence sources, which are all out there. So how did naval intelligence perceive China and Japan before the war broke out? Let's talk a little about that. As I said, before the 30s, it was mainly, you know, the safety of American lives and American interests. But by the early 1930s, they expanded their operations because Japan was also expanding their hold on China. Why? Because Japan pushed into Manchu War. The Manchurian incident was the catalyst. The U.S. Navy was beginning to fear that actually this Japanese expansion was a two-edged sword, would also encourage a rising hatred of the Japanese because of Chinese nationalism. So now they're beginning to focus, okay, we need to do more intelligence studies. We need to focus on Japanese military operations because, you know, things are getting really tough now in the north because, you know, if you know history, it was the Kwangtung Army who instigated the incident to take over Manchuria, you know, Gekokujo, these mid-level officers who instigated it. And they did. The naval intelligence immediately sent people out to check on the case. But, you know, even Professor Cook's book doesn't have that footnote on there that to utilize these naval intelligence reports that came back to Washington. You know, he would have had a different take. So, but at that time, Americans knew that they could only watch because we were not ready, and isolation sentiment back in the U.S. prevented us from taking any other overt action. But we knew it's coming. War Plan Orange was developed, and that was a contingency war plan against Japan in 1905, right after the Russo-Japanese War. So we knew it was coming. And we saw that after the Manchurian incident, things are getting touchy now, but yet we couldn't do it. And now the Americans, especially the Navy, they're beginning to see, whoa, you know, the Chinese are fighting back. Maybe it's a good time to utilize our Chinese allies, not quite allies, to buy time. We will give them moral and financial support to tie down the Japanese. Because it was costing Japan a lot of money. Troops were pouring into North China, Manchuria, and American naval planners were thinking, well, we need to create a quagmire for them. It is like our today's version of a Vietnam for Japan. And indeed, you see that in North China, because Chung-Sik Lee of Rand Corporation wrote a study, Japanese counterinsurgency in Manchuria, classic book, Chinese guerrilla warfare. And then American planners are saying, this is how we're gonna drain Japan of his resources, drain Japan of his military might, by using the Chinese as our mercenaries. It wasn't for the love of the Chinese, I can guarantee you that. So by 1938, the U.S. is doubling up on the collection agency, naval intelligence, because they desperately need more information on Japan's military capabilities, because Japan is a police state. It was almost impossible to get good military intelligence out of the Japanese islands, because you were under supervision everywhere you went. And then they saw now, wow, with this fighting in China, we've got a great opportunity to learn how good the Japanese are, at really no risk to our lives. And by doing that, I can't allude it to, but by doing all these detailed reports and expanding the naval intelligence process in China, it also reviewed a substantial amount of information about the Chinese economic conditions, geography, political, and social conditions. When you read these reports, they have entire sections. This weekly report on China's economic situation, this weekly report on Chinese political, and they will list the names. And I would check for accuracy, military, and these are reports on China on a weekly basis, intelligence reports. It will be vital to anybody who's trying to recreate China of that era too, and especially for non-Chinese speaking researchers. You no longer have to be able to read, Chinese newspapers or Chinese sources, because we have this in English done by our Navy. And then this commitment to Asia is not new. I said Obama's talk about a pivot back to Asia. I said, well, what pivot? I said, I'll return back to Asia. I said we've always been interested in China and East Asia, and in the 20s, actually, we had U.S. Marine operatives working out in the Western and Central Pacific to check on Japanese islands to see if they were fortified. So I see the current pivot as a return to what we were doing, and my sources in this collection talks about it. And one of the greatest opportunities that we really had was the Battle of Shanghai in 1932. There's a general belief that it was the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 that gave the world and the Americans a better understanding of Japanese military capabilities. Not so. It was the Battle of Shanghai in 1932, also known to the Chinese and Japanese as the 28th January incident. This short but very intense conflict generated a huge amount of radio traffic, especially diplomatic and Japanese naval traffic, which allowed our cryptographers and radio intercept operators to make major breakthroughs in the deciphering and the decoding of Japanese diplomatic and naval communications. It was in Shanghai. Intelligence officers from the Navy were in the field. They were there to personally, firsthand, observe Japanese aerial, naval, and military operations, and they generated hundreds of reports. They were also able to acquire a large amount of Japanese ordnance, That's equipment from the battlefields, well before 1937. And for the better part of the 1930s, Naval Intelligence kept collecting all this information that they were building into this huge reference book called the China Monograph. Is equivalent to today's CIA country studies. But the Navy had that going for them already in the early 30s. And then a key part behind this process was also, I'll touch upon it briefly, the Navy's Chinese language program. It was initially recommended by the U.S. Marines, because the Marines knew, they said, one day if there's going to be a conflict in East Asia, it's going to be us and it's going to be in China, and we need to have our officers and soldiers understand Chinese. And it first was started in Peking, of course, at the legation, and it was based on the Pettis program. He was a famous language teacher in China, and one of his most famous students was General Stilwell, Joseph Stilwell. Joseph Stilwell learned Chinese from the Pettis program. Actually, they became lifelong friends as a result of that, and Pettis was the one who designed the Navy's program too. And in 1921, they were thinking about changing the program to Shanghai, but then the Director of Naval Intelligence and the commander of the Asiatic Fleet said no, it would send the wrong political message because Beijing is the capital and we should keep the program there. So it wasn't moved, but there was talk, because Shanghai was the hub of all the foreign activities they could mix in. But I don't know if they thought about, whether they understood the difference between the dialects. Shanghainese and Goryeo is different. Mandarin is two different dialects. It's not as distinct as Cantonese and Mandarin, but Shanghainese speak Shanghainese dialect, and Northerners speak. So I couldn't find that in the records. As I said, that is a program I would like to do more research on myself, or encourage others to do more research, is the Navy's Chinese language program. And actually the Navy's Chinese program was quite successful. It started mostly with Marines, as I said, but after the Manchurian incident, they included naval officers. But that's why I brought a book. And I kept asking myself, how good are these guys? And I finally found James McHugh's Chinese homework and quizzes. Excellent. But it took me all day, because I'm going through the legation, the social event files. I went through like 60 boxes. It's like 8 o'clock at night. There's one box left. I said, maybe I should just go home. It's not in these 60 boxes. But I did. I looked at bingo, Chinese language program. The files were in there. And the guy's calligraphy was excellent. Most Chinese are very biased. White people can't read and write like a Chinese. But I was amazed. This guy is good. And then I found this book, Introductory Mandarin Lessons, published by Kelly and Walsh in Shanghai in 1932. James McHugh, in 10 years from learning Chinese, was able to publish a book on learning Mandarin. Amazing. I just discovered this last week, I don't know if you folks have a copy here at the library. But, but yes, Oh, it's going to cost Stan something. So these Chinese language officers really contributed to the intelligence process, because, you can speak the language, you can mingle with the people. But then I said that it wasn't just James McHugh. There's other ones too, like Samuel Griffith. Samuel Griffith got his PhD in Chinese military history from Oxford, and he was the first one to translate Sun Tzu's Art of War, published by Oxford in 1963. He was a U.S. Marine officer, became a general, and then he also translated Mao Zedong's on guerrilla warfare, and he did his language training in China. And actually, he returned during World War II to fight with Evans Carlson, another language officer with the Carlson's Raiders in the Pacific. These were all former Chinese language officers. Let's talk a little bit about the Asiatic Fleet. The Asiatic Fleet was the main naval power behind American diplomacy in Asia. And under the Asiatic Fleet, we find the Yangtze River Patrol and the South China Patrol. Yangtze River, northern inland waterways, South China, same thing. And then sometimes when I taught, I would tell my students, look at, imperialism, extraterritoriality. Now, how would we like it, if Chinese gunboats were sailing up the Sacramento River or the Hudson, or the Potomac? That's what we were doing to protect American lives and interests. And all the vessels from the fleet, everything, visited Shanghai on a regular basis. Shanghai was the R&R place because that's where it was all happening. They felt comfortable. So that's why we see they were technically based in Manila, but they spent more time in Shanghai than Manila, and they really enjoyed it. And the commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet had a formidable fleet. In 1930, he had around 25 vessels, and by 1941, he had 60 vessels. Heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, gunboats, patrol boats, and even submarines. And of course, the Yangtze Patrol is best known to the public because of the sinking of the Panay, and also because of the movie Sand Pebbles. Steve McQueen, Candice Bergen, Mako, Attenborough. And I love the last scene when Steve McQueen is dying. He said, "I was home. What happened? What the hell happened?" It's like, what are we doing in China? They didn't. Yeah, yes, he is the expert. Because of the growing operational needs now in the 30s for the Navy to travel, throughout China, through the waterways, they needed special boats that could handle the rapids like the Yangtze. And the Navy had two original ones, the USS Palos and the Monocacy. The Mare Island Naval Shipyard built these in Vallejo, and these were sent to China in the early 20s. But then by 1924, the Qiangnan Shipyard in Shanghai was asked to custom build 6 new similar gunboats for the U.S. Navy, and of course the most famous one, the USS Panay, but that was built in China. Shanghai gets credit again because of that. And one of the main missions for the Asiatic Fleet and these gunboats was communications intelligence, we call that. When you intercept radio communications, that's what we base a lot of our operations on. There were several types of radio interception. One was the ability to lock into the enemy's communications, capture it, decrypt it, decipher it, and then translate it if it wasn't in English. A lot of work. This was the most difficult part. But radio intelligence also included direction finding. Where is the radio signals coming from? What direction? And traffic analysis. Traffic analysis is given it enough signals, you can determine specific units, specific ships, and specific military groups. So we did a lot of that with the Asiatic Fleet. And the first shore-based U.S. Navy intercept station was known as Station A. Makes sense, the first one. Station A, on military lingo, they call it Station Able. And it was established in 1924 at the American consulate in Shanghai. Operations were directed primarily against Japanese naval communications from the consulate in Shanghai. But in 1927, it was relocated on board the USS General Alava. It's a ship that was also based in Shanghai. They figured it would be safer if it was on a ship and not on land where everybody could see it. So they moved our intercept station there. And the main mission was to concentrate now on Japanese diplomatic signals, to tap into the radio traffic between Tokyo and the consulates in China. And when there was no diplomatic traffic, the unit worked on the signals of the Japanese Navy. And by 1929 now, the Shanghai operation had collected more than 10,000 Japanese diplomatic messages and almost 2,000 Japanese naval messages. And now let's go on to 31. The radio security station now took over from Shanghai, and it provided great coverage because of the Manchurian incident, because of Japanese military operations. Every time you have that, boom, you have to have a lot of signals. And our people were having a field day. The closeness of the fighting and the proximity to our intercept station gave us a lot of information. The Asiatic Fleet also operated quite a few mobile intercept operations. These were the ones that were based on the gunboats and the ships. So we had our land-based ones, and then we had a mobile one. And I said that's why people shouldn't be, too surprised, with the Snowden revelation. Intercepting communication goes back to the 20s, goes back to the Washington Naval Conference, Yardley. So the government's been doing that for a long time, and getting better and better at it. Scarily. By 1931, the Navy managed to solve 26 Japanese diplomatic and consular communication systems. Quite a task. And these included radio traffic used in North and South America, in Hawaii, the Philippines, Manchuria, and China. The great results of the monitoring and interception of the Japanese Navy's maneuvers in 1930 also reconfirmed the great value of radio communications. And the operation was credited, but I don't know if there's enough fact to support it, with forecasting Japan's move into Manchuria. On September 18th, 1931, a lone Marine intercept operator by the name of Corporal Lesko, he's very famous in NSA history, he was on watch, and he noticed a huge increase in message volume on Japanese diplomatic circuits, all high priority, and he reported, something's happening out there. They went crazy early this morning before it was even daylight, and it was the Manchurian incident. So that was reported back to Washington. So we had a lot of signals. That's why, with hindsight and everything, when we look back at it, we can update our historical record, By the summer of 1935, they decided to reopen the Shanghai station. It was first located in a small wooden shack on top of a two-story building in Haiphong Road. It was moved to the roof of the 4th Marine headquarters building in 1607 Sinza Road, S-I-N-Z-A. And these new quarters at the Sinza Road were more spacious, and it was more secure, and these operations are usually located on the roofs, so it's easier to capture communications. And that's why military jargon, if you go back to the veterans, they call themselves on the roof gang. And that's the name of the newsletter, one of the newsletters too. And their mission was also to decrypt, translate, and digest Japanese diplomatic traffic that they intercepted. And one of the greatest opportunities that came was the Second Battle of Shanghai in 1937. Lots of radio traffic for interception. They even intercepted messages between Japanese naval pilots and their ground controllers when they bombed and attacked the USS Panay. These were caught. But then it goes both ways. The USS Panay, let me talk briefly about the USS Panay. Okay, American gunboat going down the river. The Japanese are informed about it ahead of time. They fly a huge flag on top of the vessel. Japanese know, boom. They sank the Panay. Japanese are quick. They apologize. They normally don't. And they paid $2 million reparations right away. And then on top of that, said, all right, we will help you salvage the boat. Well, then I found in the records communications between two U.S. gunboat captains said, do you think the Japs intercepted our communications, read our radio communications, and knew that we were transporting a crate of Japanese aircraft equipment back to Washington for intelligence study? So that gives another angle to the sinking of the Panay. All these years were, oh, it was a mistake, the Japanese, but now we have evidence that the Panay was carrying Japanese airplane parts back to Washington, D.C. for analysis. And of course, the Japanese are not going to let you do that. They sank the Panay. So this is just one example of how these sources can be used. And by 1937, one of the best sources of intelligence coming out of China for the U.S. Navy are the 4th Marines. The 4th Marines were based primarily in Shanghai. They had years of experience there. They had the language officers there, and their reports were thorough. Not just because there were so many other foreign contacts there they could utilize, but they also translated Shanghai newspapers. They had contacts with local journalists, and they also worked very closely with the Shanghai Municipal Police, British intelligence, and also representatives of the U.S. Department of Treasury, Agriculture, and Commerce and Labor. We all had offices there. The Navy even had a purchasing office. That's why we had those gunboats. And then you can tell from their reports, they're very detailed. These are, as Ken alluded to, some of these reports, weekly reports are 40 to 50 pages each. So I have a whole bunch online. I couldn't afford to do too much more. There's 26,000 pages, but back then it cost me on an average 20 cents per Xerox copy. So I remember I was a struggling grad student. I had to borrow money from everybody, short of borrowing from Stan, but it cost me a lot of money. So what is still at the archives are the ones that I couldn't afford to Xerox. One day, if I had the time, I would go back to try and mine, and then given time too, because they're constantly accessioning new documents. They do pull documents out of the National Archive. It has been done. Clinton declassified, President Clinton, 200 million copies. Bush went back and reclassified another 10 million. So that does happen. But on a normal basis, because of a time frame, 25 years is a frame for federal documents to be declassified. 50 years for intelligence and sensitive ones. So there's always new material going into the archives. And then you should always do your homework before you go. Let me just talk a little bit more about 1932, which a lot of books don't really cover that well. It was, we had many people there, and it was an incident that was started by the Japanese Navy because they were jealous that the Kwangtung Army, the Army, got all the credit for the Manchurian incident, and they're the ones. Admiral Shiozawa turned on the Chinese, but little did it expect Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese to resist so stubbornly. And I think I found it on your website. Donald Jordan, I think he wrote a book saying that, well, all these years, 19th Route Army, Cantonese Army, Guangdong, Hamna Guangdong. And the mayor of Shanghai at that time too was also Cantonese. They got the credit. What about? But Chiang Kai-shek also threw in his German-trained 87th and 88th Division, his best crack troops, and the 5th Chinese Army. And Donald Jordan argues, and I read some of the reviews that agreed with him, that the Cantonese Army got all the credit, What about the 87th, 88th, 5th Army? No. There are reports in my collection that the Americans credit and talks about the 87th, 88th Division. So if Donald Jordan had looked at my sources, he may have come to a different conclusion, or he may not have been so biased against my Cantonese colleagues, But just food for thought. And then the key thing that this is 1932. The Americans and the Japanese are not really enemies yet. Actually, the American commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet, when the Japanese faced so much resistance, they had to call for reinforcements from Japan. They had to send 18,000 troops initially, 2 aircraft carriers, a whole fleet to reinforce Shanghai. And the commander, his name was Kichisaburo Nomura. The same Nomura in Shanghai as the ambassador 1941. And it was here at Shanghai too, during the battle, they had a celebration for the emperor's birthday. A Korean nationalist set off a bomb, and that's how Nomura lost one of his eyes. It was Shanghai in 1932. So we keep seeing the Shanghai connection, you know. And with this operation, our Marine and Navy observers were able to send a shipload of battlefield ordnance back to Washington, D.C. They discovered right now that China would definitely be a good asset to hold down the Japanese military might. And they were also elated about the material that they got. The former head of the Far East section said, "We had a wonderful opportunity to pick up a lot of Japanese materials, some expended and some not, and our Asiatic Fleet intelligence officers was very much on the job, and parties began scavenging for stuff all over the place, and we sent a shipload of this stuff back here to D.C." This was the first time U.S. intelligence had such detailed information, but they were also able to evaluate Chinese troops. And this is the comment. The operation was a peculiar one in that it was possible to visit the Chinese headquarters in the morning, this being in an area just north of the settlement, and then coming through the settlement and traveling to the eastward in the direction of Hongkou, one could visit the Japanese headquarters in the afternoon. In that way, one had the proper passes and knew who to talk to. It was possible to follow the course of the fighting with great ease. As they say, in the morning, you go to Chinese front lines. In the afternoon, you go to Japanese front lines. It was excellent. It was at this time, too, that we actually learned a lot about Japanese aerial operations. Because it was in Shanghai, as Barbara Tuckman pointed out, first time a major city and mass civilian casualty occurred because of Japanese bombing and aerial operations was Shanghai in 1932, because that was even before Guernica. And of course, our intelligence officer, they had a field day. You know, they kept track of both Japanese pursuit and bomber planes. And as they noted, a large percentage of the bombs were duds, placed as high as 75%. And they noted that the use of demolition or fragmentation bombs and incendiary bombs were very high and very accurate. So this has never been seen in an urban area. And of course, the Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet and the Department of Naval Intelligence was very, very happy because of the thorough coverage. But it was becoming a point now that the Asiatic Fleet Commander-in-Chief said, "Wow, this is beginning to affect our American business and interests. If this keeps going on, you know, it won't be good for us. Maybe perhaps it's best that the 19th Route Army and the 87th and 88th Division get thoroughly beaten by the Japanese." But no, didn't need that, because by early March, the Chinese had ran out of supplies and manpower, no reinforcements, and they had to sue for peace. So that's how the first incident ended. And some of the reports coming back from that operation were quite insightful. A Marine major noted that although the Japanese Army had made many mistakes and the staff officers were only classified as fair, it would be hasty to conclude that the Japanese troops should not be considered first class. In his opinion, the morale of the men, the Japanese, were good, and they acted courageously in battle. And I quote, "Throughout the operation, the Army troops exhibited a bulldog aggressiveness that would test the fighting ability of any opponent." We would see that in World War II. He also concluded that despite the poor performance of the Japanese Army, the Japanese undoubtedly learned from their mistakes to ensure that it would not happen again. And they also informed Washington that the Japanese favored night fighting during the operations. It's something that we weren't used to. A lot of armies don't train for night fighting. And quote, "Their night movements when unopposed were well conducted and the night's attacks were very successful." And he reminded Washington that the Japanese had a predilection for the cover of darkness and to be so prepared for that. And aerial operations, some of the reports were confusing. There were reports who also noted, that the Japanese. A lot of studies said we underestimated the Japanese pilots, And then one study said that the Japanese bombs were inaccurate and the Japanese pilots were mediocre. But there were other ones who said otherwise, and they also noted that Japanese were getting a lot of help from foreigners too to build their aircraft. And Campbell, the officer, he did admit it was very difficult to evaluate and rate Japanese aviators because of such a diversity of opinion. But he concluded again that Japanese aviation should not be underestimated, as it was in excellent condition and more efficient than we generally believed. He warned that the Japanese military and naval aviators were constantly improving and that it was growing with unrestrainable rapidity. In fact, the Japanese were probably better trained than the Americans in night fighting and operations and during bad weather conditions. And he added, during the year 1933, Blue was the code name for the United States, can hope for superiority in airmanship only. The only advantage may likely be offset by Orange. So this study ended by cautioning that it would be unwise and dangerous to assume that the United States was greatly superior in aviation. It would be wrong. And during 1937, another myth was the Japanese Zero fighter. The West didn't know about it until the war. No, not true. The Japanese deployed the Zero in late November 1940. And because of the interrogation by the Chinese of a Japanese pilot, and also we had captured parts of a Japanese Zero that was downed, Washington Office of Naval Intelligence by summer of 1941 had a full picture on the Zero, the capability, the performance of the Zero fighter. Again, it came from China. And nobody noticed that. And Marine operators were also watching during the 1937 operation. Marines are always interested in landings, amphibious landings. And a fellow named Victor Krulak, actually I met him, I interviewed him in San Diego. He became the Commandant of Marine Corps, and then his son became Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a Marine officer there. He said, all I had to do was climb on a rooftop balcony. He had a naval photographer, started taking pictures of Japanese Marine landing operations. They were stunned. Wow, these Japanese landing ships are top rate. He went back to Washington, brought a model with him to show the Commandant, went all the way to Secretary of Defense, and it was sent to a designer in America by the name of Higgins, who started designing the Higgins landing boat for all Marine operations for the United States in World War II. So that came from the field. Okay. If ONI Naval Intelligence had done such a great job, then why was the Navy caught napping December 7th? No, but I had all this information. Now, how were the Japanese able to catch us sleeping? You know? Oh, but then Washington looked at the intelligence that came with the facts. The facts was Japan was heavily entrenched in a conflict on the Chinese mainland for over a decade, with no end in sight. Thousands of Japanese lives were lost. By 1938, according to sources, both Japanese and U.S., almost 1 million men were committed to the China campaign. Millions of dollars were spent on that, and yet the Chinese were fighting back. The Kuomintang and the CCP, Kuomintang actually, put the differences together to resist the invaders, And this encouraged American planners to think the Japanese are really too bogged down. They don't have the resources to widen the war. They got a huge counterinsurgency problem in the north. It was just going to be a matter of time before Japan gets exhausted by this operation. They just didn't think that Japan was ready to expand the operations to fight the United States. It would be suicide. And adding to that, of course, they factored in the Battle of Lake Hassan in 1938 and 39. Major conflict, small war conflict between Outer Mongolia, Russians, and the elite Japanese Kwangtung Army. 1938 was the Lake Hassan incident, and 1939 was Nomonhan or Kaklingo. That was huge. Zhukov. General Zhukov was the one who led the Russians. Nobody knows about this small little war. My mentor wrote a 2,000-page book on it. That's why I know a little bit about it. The Russians sent 2,000 planes, 5,000 tanks, crushed the Kwangtung Army. Boom. That was the reason, one of the major reasons why Pearl Harbor happened, because the Army's idea was pushing through. We're going to go north. We're going to beat the Soviets, but after that, they deferred. We're going to go south. We're going to agree with the Navy. And all that helped the Americans think that Japan's not going to attack us. It's got a huge mess, And on top of that, 1940, we sent the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers. They're totally illegal because we're a neutral country, And then there was a memo signed by Franklin Roosevelt that we were to start bombing the Japanese islands from bases in China by November 1941. And there is talk, and one of my friends who's doing research, that the Japanese intercepted this communication, and that's why Pearl Harbor carried out briefly, because we were the second AVG group, were sent bombers, 80 bombers, and the plan was to use Chinese coastal areas to bomb the home islands of Japan. So these facts load us, but ultimately, what happened? Okay, all right, Pearl Harbor we understand, but how did we lose China? Everybody say, we lost China at the end of the war. That was a State Department purges, everybody purges, Well, but the Navy, and the Navy had such a cadre, a good collection of experienced officers in China. What the heck happened? Well, because once the war started, things were different. All these language officers, all these war officers in the Marine Corps and Navy words, you have to do sea duty. Otherwise, you don't get promoted. They were put into combat. Marines were sent to the Aleutians campaign. Evans Carlson developed the first, the Navy SEAL team. Evans Raiders, McHugh became an OSS officer. But the thing that killed it was the transformation, the development of SACO, S-A-C-O. The Sino-American Cooperative Organization. That was in charge of the Navy entire operation in China. It was started in late 1942. The guy named Commodore Milton Miles, and he said, I don't want anybody in my team to be sent to China with me if they have any previous experience. Disastrous. And they did. They're the ones that hooked up with Dai Li, with fascism. They carried out assassination program. SACO to this day is hated by the communists. So that's what happened to the Navy. We lost all these experts because of Milton Miles. But yet you also have to look at it at a different point before I end all this. For Japan, those 20 years of fighting also gave them the opportunity to learn from their lessons. They had actual combat experience. Sure, they took a lot of losses, but that's how they became better and better. Because they had, and why do you think a lot of countries now volunteer to fight in Iraq, Afghanistan, South Korea, always does, to get actual combat experience? And Japan had those 15, 20 years, you know? And as I said, the details and reports are all part of this digital collection. So I encourage you, do more research. And as Ken warned you, you do have to do some digging. It's not handed to you on a silver platter. So at least you don't have to travel to Washington, D.C. You don't have to travel worldwide to the archives. You do need to at least click on the website, go in and enjoy,